Leah van Poppel. I'm the CEO of Women with Disabilities Victoria, and my pronouns are she and her. Women with Disabilities Victoria is an organisation run by and for women with disabilities. We'd like to welcome you really warmly today, our members, our stakeholders and guests to our International Women's Day event, Prevention of Violence Against Women with Disabilities, Workforce Resource for Action. For those who've just popped into the meeting, I'd just like to remind you all that the event will be recorded. Your video should be off by default, but if you don't want to be filmed in the recording and your video happens to be turned on, you can select stop video. The instructions are on the screen for you now. Auslan and captioning are available during this event. The invitation email for this event has a link under accessibility to all of the accessible versions of the resources we're showcasing today. If you're on computers, please keep your Zoom on speaker view for best results. Mobile phones do have limited accessibility options available. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all meeting across Victoria. And in my case, interstate, I happen to be coming to you from northern New South Wales today. So I am on the lands of the Gumbaginia people in northern New South Wales. And I pay my respects to leaders past and present and young leaders emerging in Aboriginal communities wherever you are today. We are going to be talking about violence against women with disabilities today. This can be a really difficult topic for people to think about. So we encourage anyone who might be finding that challenging today to just take care in being part of this forum, to take a break if you need, because we are recording, as I said earlier, so you can go back and look at things if you're finding it a bit too confronting, and to practice any sort of self-care strategies for you that might be making sure that you have someone to chat to outside of this meeting, for instance. If you or someone you know is experiencing violence, you can ring 1-800-RESPECT for support. That's 1-800-737-732. You can also reach out to someone through WDV. Today in the chat, you can reach out to Helen Ferris, who will be able to support you in finding other resources or supports that you might need to access if you're experiencing violence or if this session today raises any issues for you. Now, I'd like to thank you again all very much for joining us. In line with International Women's Day theme this year, Choose to Challenge, we are choosing to challenge the ongoing epidemic of violence against women, specifically violence against women with disabilities. Today, we're launching new workforce resources for the prevention of violence against women with disabilities. Last year, the Centre for Research Excellence in Disability and Health produced the Violence Against People with Disability fact sheets, using data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics collected as part of the Personal Safety Survey. This research showed that women with disabilities are experiencing exceptionally high rates of violence, rates that are far higher than those compared to people who don't have a disability and compared to men with disabilities. For example, the research tells us that 48% of women with disability report experiencing physical violence, compared to 28% of women without disability. We know that 33% of women with disability report experiencing sexual violence, compared to 16% of women without disability. And that 27% of women with disability report being stalked or harassed, compared to 16% of women who don't have a disability. It's really easy to be overwhelmed by the size of these numbers and to forget that there are real women behind these statistics, women whose names are usually only learned when the worst possible scenario comes to light. That's women like Anne-Marie Smith, a 54-year-old woman with cerebral palsy who died on April 6th of last year. Investigations into her death have found that she died in squalid and appalling circumstances after a substantial period of neglect by her disability support worker. It's women like Kim Hunt, whose husband murdered her and their 3 children before killing himself. In the inquiry into their deaths, Kim's acquired brain injury was used to blame her for the deaths, suggesting that she had become a burden to her husband and that changes to her personality had left him with no other option, and that he had even murdered them with quote unquote pseudo-altruistic intent. Women and girls like Willow Dunn, a 4-year-old girl with Down syndrome, whose father was last year charged with her murder. In the last few years, there have been numerous reports of women with disability being stalked and sexually assaulted in public spaces. In 2018, a teenage girl was bashed by 3 other girls in a public park in regional Victoria. A Melbourne man last year lured a woman with an intellectual disability into a public toilet block before sexually assaulting her. Women with disabilities are experiencing violence from paid carers, from parents and other family members, from intimate partners, from adult children, and from strangers. This abuse is happening in family homes, in supported accommodation, in hospitals, prisons, and other institutions, and in public spaces. These deaths are unacceptable. This violence is unacceptable. And while we grieve these deaths and this violence, and while we strive to make reforms to make response and support services more accessible for women with disabilities, we also have the opportunity to look to primary prevention to stop this violence from occurring in the first place. Primary prevention sounds like a complicated term, but it's really about understanding what drives violence against women with disabilities and addressing and eliminating those drivers, which can be about our attitudes and the way that we think and the way that we value women with disabilities. Many of you will be familiar with Change the Story, our national framework for the prevention of violence against women and their children. Led by Our Watch, Change the Story is an evidence-based and groundbreaking piece of work, setting the roadmap for how to actualise the prevention of violence against women in Australia. Change the Story sets out an explanatory model of violence, articulating 4 key drivers and 5 essential actions to prevent violence. WDV is proud to be launching resources today that place a disability lens over these drivers and essential actions from Change the Story, particularly in the context for workforces, for those of you in disability support and in social service sectors. We've combined the evidence of what we know about what drives gender-based violence with what we know about what drives disability-based violence. The answer regarding what drives violence is complex, but also surprisingly simple on the surface. Gender-based violence is rooted in gender inequality, and disability-based violence is rooted in disability inequality. Women with disabilities experience both. The resources that we're launching today make it clear that when society condones violence against women with disabilities, when society is allowed to limit the independence and decision-making of women with disabilities, when society allows gender and disability stereotypes to thrive, and when society allows disrespect towards women with disabilities to thrive, then violence against women with disabilities will also thrive. Gender and disability inequality exist in the sexist and ableist norms of our institutions, our workplaces, our recreational spaces, our households, our media, our so-called jokes, and even the very infrastructure of our buildings, our transport, and our streets. But amongst the evidence about what drives violence against women with disabilities, there is good news here too. Primary prevention of violence against women with disabilities is an ambitious project, but the evidence itself tells us that it is actually possible. By addressing the evidence-based drivers and by promoting and normalising gender and disability equality across society, we can prevent violence against women with disabilities and create a more equitable place to live for all of us. This is a whole of population problem, which means that everyone has a role to play. We know that there are real, concrete, evidence-based actions we can take, and we're excited today to be launching a set of resources to support the disability and social service sector to undertake this work. Before we get into our webinar today to present the new resources, we have invited Melissa from Our Watch to speak about further resources for the prevention of violence against women with disabilities that are currently in development and due to be launched by Our Watch and WDV later this year. We're really proud of our partnership work with Our Watch and really pleased that Melissa and our very own Jen Hargrave are going to be able to speak to you about some of the broader work that we're doing in this space now. So Melissa and Jen, over to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Leah. I think I'm off mute now. Great. As you know, we're here today to mark International Women's Day and to launch WDV's new resources. While we were here, we wanted to take the chance to tell you about some relevant work that WDV's been doing with Our Watch. So as Leah said, Our Watch is the national agency to prevent violence against women and their children. And in a moment, I'll introduce you to Melissa O'Reilly, who we've been working with from Our Watch. This project started around 5 years ago when the great feminist disabled leader, Sue Salthouse, donated money to Our Watch. Sue was an Our Watch ambassador, and she wanted Our Watch to do work that focused on prevention of violence against women and girls. So the project began with an evidence review about the drivers of violence against women and girls with disabilities. And as Leah said, Our Watch is known for having developed the national framework, Change the Story, on the prevention of violence against women and their children. And since making that framework, they've also made a framework which focuses on prevention of violence against Aboriginal women and their children, which is called Change the Picture. So this project Our Watch is doing will sit alongside those two resources with a focus on women and girls with disabilities. We believe it will complement the resources that WDV is launching today. So I'll hand over to Mel to tell us a bit more about the project.
Hi, thanks for that, Jen. Thank you very much to WDV for having me here today. I'm Melissa O'Reilly, the Senior Policy Advisor for Women with Disabilities at Our Watch, and I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So as Jen said, Our Watch and WDV have formed a partnership to develop a resource on the prevention of violence against women with disabilities. Now, the resource is still in development, so we can't describe it in too much detail at this point, but we wanted to give today a bit of an overview about what to expect. To inform this work that we've been doing, we have the guidance and support of an incredible project advisory group with members from organisations including Women with Disabilities Australia, People with Disability Australia, the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, and also SECA, who are an organisation based in Western Australia. And we also have some fantastic individual representatives on our advisory group as well. Over the last year, we also consulted with around 40 stakeholders from the disability, women's health, and violence against women sectors across the country. So we covered each state and territory. And I think some of the people we consulted might actually be here today as well. So a big shout out and a thank you to those people for their contributions to this process. So the work, as Jen mentioned, it also draws on the available literature. So the first step of this process was creating a literature review, and that evidence is informing the development of this resource. The resource will start by helping to build an understanding of violence against women with disabilities. So it describes the nature of this violence, such as the kinds of violence women with disability experience, the prevalence of this violence, the settings it occurs in, as well as some of the impacts it can have. And then to help us understand this violence, especially to understand why the rates of this violence are so high, this resource takes some time to explore the underlying drivers of violence against women with disabilities. And it will particularly focus on how gender inequality intersects with ableism to drive violence against women with disabilities. So the work really draws on the gendered approach of Change the Story, but it combines that with an understanding of the different and intersecting forms of discrimination and inequality that women with disability also experience. Since this will be a primary prevention resource, it will also provide some actions that aim to prevent violence against women with disability by addressing those underlying drivers that we identify in the resource. And we'll also outline some of the principles for good practice that are important to guide this work. So as I said, it's still in development at this point, but we're planning for the work to be finished and released later in the year. We don't have a specific launch date at the moment, but we will be, once we work that out, we'll be keeping everyone informed. And when we release that information, we'll also be releasing it in conjunction with the literature review that Jen was referring to earlier. So that's it from me at the moment. But as I said, a big thanks to WDV for letting us give a bit of an update about this work at the moment. And I think at the moment I need to pass back to Bianca to continue with WDV's proceedings for today. So thanks for having me here. You're on mute, Bianca.
Thank you very much. I had not noticed that. I was just saying thanks so much to Jen and Melissa. WDV really enjoys working with Our Watch and enjoys everything that we do with you. So it's fantastic, and we're looking very much forward to the resource that you're creating at the moment. Again, everyone that's here today, thank you for coming along to our International Women's Day event. Just a little bit more about myself. So I'm Bianca Evans. I'm the G&D Workforce Development Manager, Gender and Disability Workforce Development Manager. I identify as a victim survivor of violence, an Anglo-queer woman with disabilities living on stolen land, with all the privilege and disadvantage that that kind of entails. So I try and always come from that kind of intersectional approach, which is what WDV kind of specialises in. I'm currently presenting on Wurundjeri land, and I'm just going to introduce our next facilitators. So first up, we have Tess Karambellis. Tess is a social worker with a lived experience of cerebral palsy, who is passionate about creating a world free from violence and discrimination for women with disabilities. She's been working in the workforce development team as a trainer and co-facilitator at WDV for over 2 years now, and has recently completed a Certificate 4 in Training and Assessment. She is one of our fantastic facilitators. Welcome, Tess, and we look forward to hearing from you today about the resources that we're launching. The other facilitator I'd like to introduce is Olivia Franklin. Olivia has a background in family violence response and international development, with a focus on women's rights. She is a passionate feminist and committed to ending violence against all women. Olivia is in our prevention team and our prevention training coordinator. So she'll also be facilitating with Tess today to launch our resources. So thank you both, and I will pass over to both of you to continue our session.
Thank you, Bianca, and thank you so much everybody for being here today to help us launch our wonderful new resources. Before Tess and I get started, I just wanted to recognise my privilege as an able-bodied woman as well. I'm one of the few able-bodied women who has the privilege of working at WDV. And it's an ongoing journey for me to learn so much about the disability sector, the disability community, and just to benefit from the amazing lived experience of all my colleagues. I'm very, very lucky to be able to do that. So Tess and I are going to give you a brief facilitation of our new resources today, which is also sort of a bit of a taster of the training that we offer, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But first of all, and has been previously mentioned by Leah, also by Mel and Jen, This work that we're presenting today, it builds on the Our Watch Change the Story framework for the prevention of violence against women and their children. This framework highlights the 4 key gender drivers of violence against women, which are all underpinned by gender inequality, which sets the necessary social context for violence against women. And of course, this framework also highlights the essential actions that we can take as members of the community to help prevent that violence against women. Over to you, Tess.
Thanks, Leah. So we know that women with disabilities experience inequality and discrimination at the intersection of disability infographic, where women with disabilities are experiencing significantly higher rates of violence for longer periods of time and by multiple perpetrators. And some examples might be, like for me, I use a wheelchair. So some examples might be for a wheelchair user, taking a wheel off a wheelchair, or underdosing or overdosing of medication, or financial control, which I'll go into a little bit more later. Women with disabilities experience some barriers to support, and these additional barriers might include inaccessible resources or support, or being dependent on in-home care, and this leads to our experiences being minimalised and women with disabilities not being believed as the main barrier to not reporting violence.
So in the Gender and Disability Workforce Development Team at WDV, which is our team, and you're going to meet quite a few wonderful team members of ours today, our focus is on, as Leah said, upskilling the disability and social service workforces in the knowledge of what drives violence against women with disabilities and the skills in how to prevent it. So we do that by producing the resources, like the resources you're seeing today, and also delivering training to those kinds of workforces on what we can do as workers and members of the community to prevent violence against women. And this resource that we're launching today is a really key part of our work, and it really draws together a lot of the content that we've been training around for many years as the length of this program. So I will introduce briefly each of the 4 drivers and the 5 essential actions that we're going to be discussing today. And then Tess and I will go through these in a little bit more detail and give you a little bit more examples as well of what this actually looks like in a disability setting, in a disability context. So the 4 key drivers of violence against women with disabilities are the condoning of violence against women with disabilities, men's control and ableist control of decision-making and limits to the independence of women with disabilities in public and private life, stereotyped constructions of masculinity, femininity and disability and the intersecting impacts of this for women with disabilities, and sexist and ableist peer relations that emphasise aggression and disrespect towards women with disabilities. So then we've got the 5 key actions to prevent violence against women with disabilities. And the first 4 of these, as you can see, they sort of correlate pretty directly with the drivers. So these are challenging condoning of violence against women with disabilities, promoting and enabling women with disabilities independence and decision-making in public and private life, fostering positive personal identities and challenging gender and disability stereotypes and roles, and strengthening positive, equal and respectful relationships with and among people with disabilities and people of all genders. And then our 5th and final essential action kind of underpins all of these drivers and actions, and that is, of course, promoting and normalising gender equality and disability equality in all facets of life. So,
thanks, Leah.
sorry, Tess. We'll just begin with the first driver, which is condoning of violence against women with disabilities. And as we know from the Change the Story framework, and as many of you might know if you're familiar with prevention, the main kinds of condoning of violence that the Change the Story frameworks points to are trivialising, excusing, justifying, shifting blame and downplaying of violence. And these are the many ways that are sometimes quite subtle, sometimes quite overt, that all people in our society, so men and women and children, are sent the message that violence against women is, on some level, par for the course, an acceptable part of life, and something that we really should just expect.
Thanks, Olivia. So women with disabilities, of course, experience these forms of condoning of violence, as well as other forms of condoning of violence related to our disability, which are kind of perpetuated by ableist attitudes in society. And one way is through deficit language and framing our disability as kind of a tragedy or weakness or a misfortune to be overcome and suffered through. And I know that, you know, I'm a part of a very proud disability community. We all know that we don't suffer really. And basically, this kind of language sends the message to women with disabilities that we're better off dead. And this can lead to excusing men and able-bodied people who perpetrate violence against us, which kind of shifts the blame away from the perpetrator and back onto the woman with disability. But an interesting form of excusing that's very specific to women with disabilities is called the halo effect, whereby the halo effect is kind of when a carer or an intimate partner is kind of placed on a pedestal. So if you can imagine the halo effect being a halo on top of your head and being cast as this angel, because of course they're doing such a great job to, you know, take care of us and to do all these things for us, which we know is quite, the language there is quite disabling and disempowering. But yeah, so, and this attitude is often unconscious and can lead to violence because especially when someone is in a violent relationship, these kinds of attitudes like the halo effect can often lead to other people outside the relationship excusing the violent behaviour that's going on because they're being cast as such angels. And also, it's also dangerous because this assumes that the woman with disability does not have anything of value to bring to the relationship.
So another example of the way that deficit language can contribute to condoning violence against women is something that we saw quite a lot last year, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, and particularly utilised by, I'd say, the federal government most of all, but the state governments as well, in the discussion around COVID and who was at risk of contracting COVID and also who was at risk of dying from COVID. So you would have heard in the media this constant rhetoric and this fixation on the fact that it wasn't just people with disabilities or elder Australians or people with pre-existing health conditions that could die from the disease. It was actually also young and healthy people. And the way that the government kept reiterating this, it really sent the message that this was what we actually needed to be concerned about. And the loss of life of people with disabilities, older people and people with comorbidities and health conditions, that was kind of just par for the course. And we shouldn't really be concerned about that. What we should be concerned about is young, fit people who might be at risk. And it sort of seems like a subtle thing, but this is an example of the way that, you know, this ableist rhetoric and this deficit language is used at all levels of society, and even by an organisation like the federal government who should know better in these circumstances. And it sends a very strong message to people with disabilities that their lives aren't as valuable as able-bodied people. Another way that we see condoning of violence very active in the community, I think you may have all sort of been exposed to this as well, is through the media, and in particular the way that the media reports when there is actually an incident of violence against a woman or a woman with disability, like the examples that Leah mentioned in her opening speech. So I'm going to pass over now to our wonderful colleague, Kira, who's our Health Promotion Resource Development Officer. And she's going to speak a little bit about this and about deficit language, and also what we can do to combat that deficit language, which kind of leads into our next essential action. So over to you, Kira.
Thank you. Am I up?
You're up.
Beautiful. I couldn't see myself there on the screen. Thank you, Olivia and Tess, for the introduction. When I look around, there are sadly many examples of condoning violence against women with disabilities. My mind jumps to the media's portrayal, where I have seen articles describe the perpetrator of violence to be a devoted carer or a loving family member whose role as a carer just got too much. These are abhorrent and stark examples of condoning violence against women with disabilities. But today I wanted to focus on the more subtle forms that are often less talked about. Have you ever paused to notice how the woman's disability itself is talked about within these reports of violence? We are often told that the woman with the disability has a low quality of life, or she is severely disabled, or perhaps she is bound by her wheelchair. This sort of language is a way of implying that, yes, it's sad that she was hurt, or even worse, killed, but maybe if she wasn't such a burden, if her disability wasn't such a burden, then this wouldn't have happened. Using deficit language when speaking about disability is hurtful and always leads to inequality for people with disability. But when this language is coupled with talking about violence against women with disability, it serves to further condone this violence by making it seem like it's actually not that big of a deal, that it's almost inevitable, that it's to be expected, and that somehow it has lesser impact on her. But we can combat this form of condoning violence against women with disabilities by using our voice and changing our language. By using strength-based language, that is factual language that doesn't reinforce stereotypes, doesn't imply weakness, and doesn't alienate women or imply that disability is the reason for violence. So, for example, rather than saying she is suffering from dementia, you can simply say she has dementia. Instead of saying she has difficulty remembering, try saying she has a brain injury and understands language best when a written summary is provided. Using strength-based language is about upholding the dignity and the worth of people with disabilities and challenges the condoning of violence against women with disabilities. So this International Women's Day, I choose to use strength-based language, and I choose to challenge the condoning of violence against women with disabilities.
Thank you, Kira. So I'd like to introduce our next essential action, which is challenging the condoning of violence against women with disabilities. So in order to stop violence against women with disabilities, we need to challenge the language and the attitudes and behaviours that kind of condone it. So a way to do this is to stop using deficit language like Kira just mentioned, by framing disability using a strengths-based model. So women with disabilities who are in wheelchairs, instead of using wheelchair bound to describe us, because we're not, use wheelchair user, because I'm not glued to my wheelchair. I can get out at any time. It sounds silly when you put it that way, huh? And similarly, for a woman with an intellectual disability, she's not suffering from her disability, and it's just a normal part of her everyday life and her identity. So, and I guess this idea that disability is a part of human diversity, and it doesn't really need to be lamented or pitied.
Thanks, Tess. So another sort of important aspect of this challenging of condoning that we need to focus on is the way that people often shift blame away from the perpetrators of violence by focusing on factors like stress, like drug and alcohol use, like mental illness or a trauma history, for example, as reasons for the perpetrator's behaviour. We know that not all perpetrators use drugs or alcohol, and by the same token, not all trauma survivors are necessarily going to be violence users. It's really important to remember that violence is always a choice. And when we hear these excuses being played into the narrative, what we need to remember is that these aren't the drivers of violence, they're not the causes of violence. They are reinforcing factors. They may make the violence more severe or more frequent, but the person who is using the violence made the choice to do that, and that choice was not outside of their control. So one really important way that we can challenge the condoning of violence is by asserting that these are reinforcing factors when we hear these narratives coming into play, and reiterating that violence is always a choice.
Thank you, Olivia. So often in training, I like to talk about the word vulnerable, particularly because it came up in a lot of the rhetoric around the pandemic. So vulnerable, the term vulnerable is another example of deficit language that we can take action to change. So women with disabilities are not inherently vulnerable, and this was kind of a label that we didn't accept and a label cast upon us. And this sends the message that women with disabilities are helpless and we need to be protected. And of course, because we know that women with disabilities experience higher rates of violence at the intersection of gender and disability, we know that perpetrators can often use this as an excuse to target us because of our disability and to abuse us with impunity. So we can do this by taking action and shifting the blame back to the perpetrator and asserting that this language that we use when we talk about women with disabilities is more of an empowering message.
So coming on now
Olivia?
to, thanks Tess, our second driver, which is men's and ableist control of decision-making and limits to the independence of women with disabilities in public and private life. So for all women, the male control of decision-making from the individual level up to the societal level is a huge issue and a massive driver of violence. And we can see that in the Change the Story framework. But there are some specific implications of this kind of structure for women with disabilities that can have a really, really dangerous impact.
Thanks, Olivia. So now I'd like to talk about this idea of dignity of risk at the individual level, where we can see this paternalistic or protectionist view of women with disabilities that often parents have or carers have, which don't allow women with disabilities to engage in dignity of risk. And this kind of places the control and decision-making power back into able-bodied people. And we know that if, say for example, if someone grew up without a disability, they would be allowed to take concerted risks and make mistakes and learn from them. While in the same way, women with disabilities should be able to do so as well. And this is a way that we can build on our skills to learn from things rather than to limit our opportunities and independence as adults. And this is yeah. Over to you, Olivia.
So on the individual and family level, which is sort of where Tess is focusing, something that's really important to remember in the disability context is that control and abuse doesn't necessarily come from a bad place or a place of malice. Sort of controlling or directive or paternalistic practices, particularly used by a support worker or a family member who's acting as a carer, they can often come from a really well-intentioned place. It can be just the result of that person not wanting their person with disability to come to any harm or to be put in a situation where they might be uncomfortable or might not know how to handle things. But there is a line between concern and control. And it's really important that we keep sight of this line and that we're able to name the behaviours what they are when they cross that line. So even if it comes from the best possible place and a place of love and care, any behaviour that limits the freedoms and rights of people with disabilities is abuse, regardless of the intention. So we're now going to welcome back Bianca, our wonderful program manager, who's going to share with us a little bit of a lived experience perspective on able-bodied and male control of decision-making.
Thank you, Olivia and Tess. I'd like to share a little bit about myself. So way back when, I moved out of home when I was about 14, and I moved in with a boyfriend at the time. And over the course of a few years, I was living in a space that became really challenging. So initially, there was this fantastic thing that kind of went on that I thought was freedom, really. He said, you don't have to work. And I was like, okay, I don't have to work. That's great. I can focus on whatever else I want to do. And it seemed like a really cool thing. After a period of time, I was kind of like, you know, I really probably should work. And he was like, no, you don't want the stress of working. I wish I didn't have to work. It would be really great. Why don't you just focus on, like, you know, our house and family and don't worry about it. And I was like, oh, okay, well, maybe I should be grateful for this opportunity to not work. Lots of people do, but I know that many women choose not to. So this is okay. It came up again about a year later. And I was like, no, I really think I should work. This is something that I really want to do. And he was like, no, I don't think it's a thing for you. Look, you've got no skills. You haven't worked before. Why do you want to go down this path? And at the time, he was earning too much, so I couldn't get Centrelink. So there was no actual income that I could generate or have myself at the time. And I was kind of thinking, well, you know, am I being ungrateful for choosing not to work? Or, you know, is he right? What's going on here? But over time, like my sense of self-worth kind of diminished. And I thought, well, maybe I can't work. Maybe I don't have value. And I kind of became increasingly unwell. Now, the reason why I'd moved out of home was because I came from a space that wasn't wonderful. And so I had moved out, and I'd kind of grown up with a space that things could be somewhat fearful in my life. And so as things degenerated, I didn't really even notice what was going on. I was convincing myself so much that I wasn't the victim that suddenly I realized that I had become one, that I was fearful of my home. I was fearful in my bed. I was fearful about asking for things like money to pay rent or groceries, to take my pet to the vet. All of these things became like an element of fear. And every time I thought about trying to get some work, I was like, no, I won't be good enough. I won't be able to do that. Now, this wasn't just him. This wasn't just that. There was family that was reinforcing this concept. There was doctors that were saying to me, oh, you know, you've been pretty stressed lately. There's some things going on for you. Maybe you shouldn't. And I think the final nail in the coffin, so to speak, was when doctors turned around and said, no, I don't think you should work either. It's going to be too bad for your mental health, because I had just got a diagnosis. And so it became much easier to go, no, I can't work. And this created heaps of barriers for me. There was the barrier of not being able to get Centrelink. There was the barrier of not feeling like I could talk out about what was going on. There was the barrier of not being able to financially go anywhere or do anything. And things just became increasingly insular. Now, of course, that is not my life now. So for me, I really choose to challenge that kind of ableist and males control and power in private life. I think that's really important to kind of challenge those spaces. Now I live in a world that is much changed. I barely recognize the me of then. I live in a really supported space with my partner. We constantly talk about things like equal share of unpaid labor. We work from a position of dignity and respect. We work to make sure we analyze power and control, as is my job, in all aspects of our life. And we also try and make sure that the people that we work with also feel a sense of value and control within theirs. So that's kind of one of the ways that I've chosen to challenge. Olivia and Tess, back to you.
Thanks, Bianca. That's a really, really generous of you to share that lived experience with everybody. It's really wonderful to hear. Thank you. So Bianca's reflected again on that sort of individual level, but she's touched a little bit on the more institutional level as well, thinking about able-bodied control and male control when it comes to medical professionals, doctors. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about now, is that higher level of the public life where women with disabilities do have limits to their independence as well. And ableism is entrenched in so many of the systems that women with disabilities and all of us rely on. So thinking about Centrelink, Bianca gave an example there, the NDIS, education systems, public transport, and this kind of entrenched ableism in these systems, it prevents women with disabilities from being able to fully participate in public life, in social life, in the way that able-bodied people are able to. And this intersection of gender and disability equality in this context can lead to violence against women, as we know. In particular, ableist structures in workforces and particularly recruitment processes can mean that women with disabilities are absent from a lot of workplaces where important decisions are being made, thinking about management roles, thinking about corporate roles, boards, for example. And while women with disabilities are absent from these spaces, their voices and the things that are important to them are not going to be a focus. So we're going to have now another one of our amazing colleagues, but Swazik's actually on holiday in Queensland today. So she's recorded a little bit of a snippet for us. She's our Women's Health Services Capacity Building Officer, and she's going to talk about her own lived experience of ableist structures when it comes to employment.
Hi, my name is Swazik. I'm hard of hearing, and English is not my first language. I became aware of my disability when I started looking for a job in Australia after completing my PhD. It took me 14 months, over 150 job applications, and 13 interviews to find a paid job in Australia. I was told that I did not have enough research experience. Yet, I have researched gender equality for 5 years. I was told that I did not have enough facilitation experience. Yet, I have taught university classes. I was told that I did not have enough project management experience. Yet, I have worked on projects in many NGOs. When I was told that the sound of my voice was unpleasant, I became aware of the real problem. Being hard of hearing, the tone of my voice is not always what people expect. In my native language, it took me years of practice to sound how people expected. When I moved to Australia, I had to start again. Fortunately for me, my story ends well. I joined Women with Disabilities Victoria in September. The affirmative action policy acknowledges the skills of women with disabilities and made a difference in my life. After over a year of unemployment, I finally felt valued.
Thanks to Swazik, who I hope is lying on a beach somewhere right now. But that's a really, really important perspective because it is really a really serious issue, the ableism in recruitment, and particularly for women, because they're also facing those gendered structures that can make it very difficult to enter the workforce as well. Back to you, Tess.
Thanks, Olivia. So, did you know that there are currently no female members of parliament that identify as having a disability? So, this, of course, doesn't mean that there are no women with disabilities in parliament, right? And we have to kind of be careful to assume either way, or not to assume either way. So, if there is a woman with a disability in parliament, they're not kind of outwardly open about it, which makes it seem like it's not yet a safe space to come out as having a disability, so to speak. So because of this, women can't exactly advocate for the rights of others like us, or for the rights of people with disabilities. And while women with disabilities are not represented in our parliamentary system, policies that are beneficial to them, to us rather, will continue to be deprioritised. Yeah. And so I'd like to move on to the next essential action, which is to promote women with disabilities' independence and decision-making in public and private life. And in order to take action against able-bodied control and decision-making, all support workers and disability workforces must support women with disabilities to make decisions and have choice about their care, including by supporting them to take concerted risks and to develop their skills in all of these areas. So we as professionals can support this by constantly looking for opportunities to upskill and capacity build in areas relating to gender and disability. Thanks, Olivia.
As a society and as members of this social service and disability workforces, it's important that we are constantly advocating to make all spaces accessible for women with disabilities and people with disabilities. So this means schools, this means entertainment venues, restaurants, office buildings, other kinds of workplaces, public transport, parks, anywhere that an able-bodied person could access without consideration, a person with a disability should also be able to access without too much consideration. We also need to create workplaces that are inclusive and accessible for women with disabilities. So that could be, making accessible recruitment processes like we have at WDV, but it could also be things like workplace training on discrimination and unconscious bias, and not just unconscious bias as it relates to gender and disability, but also thinking about other intersections. So maybe the experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, or social and class inequality, for example.
Thanks, Olivia. So in order to ensure that kind of these systems that work for women with disabilities, such as the NDIS, are doing exactly that, we need to make sure that as workers and family members, that we're making sure that these systems are allowing women with disabilities to increase our independence and skills over time. So one way to do this is to ensure that all sexual and reproductive health services are accessible to all women, and that no women with disabilities are kind of subjected to reproductive coercion or undermining their parenting abilities.
So we're coming on now to our third driver, which is stereotype constructions of masculinity, femininity, and disability. So I'm sure I don't have to explain too much detail about gender stereotypes and the prescriptive ideas of what a man should be and what a woman should be. I'm pretty sure we're all bombarded with those 24 hours a day. But for women with disabilities, they're experiencing these gender stereotypes as well as stereotypes about disability. And that can have really, really damaging impacts. So Tess and I will go through just a couple of examples of these kinds of stereotypes and the impact that they can have on women with disabilities. So, for example, there are stereotypes out there that really frame women with disabilities as being very dependent, as maybe being not competent, and maybe being a burden. So this can mean that not only women with disabilities might be overlooked for opportunities, but they might have choices taken away from them. And it also generally means that women with disabilities are going to be less respected and less valued by society. And this kind of idea of value in society, it ties in a lot with ideas around who's a contributing member of society. And those of you who have worked in the space with elder abuse and violence against older women, you might be aware of this kind of paradigm as well, where once people are no longer active members of the workforce, they're seen as less valuable. And for people with disabilities, this is also really prevalent. And we know that when people are less respected and less valued, they're going to be more likely to experience violence, and they're going to be less likely to have people step in and report violence against them as well.
Thanks, Olivia. So another stereotype that we often know about for women with disabilities is kind of this idea that women with disabilities don't live up to the gendered stereotype of a woman being a housewife or a homemaker, which basically can lead to violence, because this kind of says that a male's expectations aren't being met and can kind of justify violence from others outside the relationship. You know, for example, why can't she cook? Why can't she clean? Like, you know, she should be able to do this. That kind of stereotype there around those kinds of ideas that can be damaging.
Another stereotype that is really prolific and that you probably have noticed as well is this idea that women with disabilities aren't reliable, and particularly this is relevant for women with intellectual disabilities and with mental health conditions. Is this idea that their stories might not have as much credit due to them. And I mean, this is inherently so dangerous, because it means that these kinds of women might not have their stories believed when they disclose violence. And it also might make them the target of violence because perpetrators are aware of this stereotype existing.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. And the final stereotype that we've come up with here is basically the assumption that people with disabilities don't want to have sex or any kind of intimate relationship, and this kind of sets the scene for people with disabilities in special schools not being taught safe sex education, respectful relationships, so that when it comes to eventually leaving school and then entering into a relationship for a woman with disability, they might not be equipped to navigate the complexity of a violent relationship.
So we're going to have now another wonderful guest who is Rosie, and she's in our team as the Our Right to Safety Resource Project Officer, and now undertaking a new role as well. But she also is a very busy lady and couldn't be here with us today. So we've got another video for you to share. And Rosie's going to talk about stereotypes and assumptions and her own lived experience of how that can impact women with disabilities.
Hi, I'm Rosie Granland. I'm a member of the Workforce Development Team at WDV. I'm a woman with disability. Having a bilateral cleft lip and palate, I've lived with the facial difference and had difficulty communicating verbally for much of my life. As a young person, people around me often made the assumption that I found it challenging to understand what they were saying. Even today, I sometimes have strangers speak to me loudly and slowly, which is humiliating and disrespectful for someone you've never met. More importantly, those around me haven't often asked me what I want to say or supported me to communicate the very many ideas that I have. Today, I choose to challenge the stereotype that any person with disability doesn't understand. In particular, I choose to challenge the stereotype that girls and women with disability are passive and don't have ideas. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosie. Over to you, Tess.
Thanks, Olivia. I feel like this is like a double up on thank yous. But my next essential action that I'd like to discuss is fostering positive personal identities and challenging gender and disability stereotypes and roles. So in order to promote positive and normalised representations of women with disabilities, we can do this kind of by making sure that women with disabilities are present in everyday life, because women with disabilities are studying, working, and living the same lives as everyone else. And did you know that approximately 1 in 5 Australians have a disability? So by showing that these women, like myself, are exceeding expectations and smashing stereotypes, we can begin to kind of disseminate these harmful and narrow views. And one example that I like to give often in our training is by me doing what I'm doing, having this role at Women with Disabilities Victoria as a trainer actively shows women with disabilities in roles that are powerful, in roles that are, which goes to show smashing these stereotypes can actually be doable.
Another way we can challenge gender and disability stereotypes is by celebrating diversity among women with disabilities. So obviously women with disabilities are not a homogenous group, and you've seen that just today with all of my amazing colleagues who are women with disabilities who have spoken to you, and there are more to come. But aside from that, you know, women with disabilities can have different cultural backgrounds, speak different languages. They could identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or a member of the LGBTQIA+ community. But as well as that, they also have a range of disabilities. And so their experience of disability is going to be different, and their perspectives on issues relating to disability might be different. So the purpose of identifying the diversity among women with disabilities is that it makes it less likely for us to form the kinds of stereotypes that we've just discussed as being really, really damaging for women with disabilities. And I want to talk briefly now as well about gender stereotypes again. And like I said, we're all pretty aware of the very rigid gender dichotomy that we live in, and the ways that that can be damaging to men and women, because the messages about what men and women should be are all around us. They are on the packaging of the products we buy at the supermarket, or in the songs we hear on the radio, or in the old-fashioned stuff our grandparents say to us constantly. But it's our responsibility all the time to be challenging this. And I know it can be really difficult, and particularly for women, there can be a lot of significant challenges involved in that. But by doing that, we can create a world where men and women and children can choose who they want to be, can choose who they want to be with, can choose what they want to do with their lives. And our children won't have to experience some of the really damaging rigid gender stereotypes that we have. So that is beneficial for all people, as well as women with disabilities specifically, who are experiencing this kind of inequality at the intersection of disability inequality.
Thanks, Olivia. So one way that we can frame disability through a strengths-based perspective is through the social model of disability. And I know that a lot of you already know the social model of disability, but just for those that don't, the social model of disability basically tells us that it is it is the society we live in and the ableist structures, policies and practices that surround us that are the disabling factor, rather than our medical conditions or our disabilities themselves. So these disabling structures might include spaces and knowledge, like biased recruitment practices, like in the video that Swazik was in, ableist structures in government and community services, and ableist attitudes can also contribute to this. You know, ableist attitudes like someone saying, I would never date anyone in a wheelchair, or maybe like a microaggression like what's her mental age, that kind of thing. And we can now focus on our efforts on reducing these ableist structures within society, rather than kind of putting the effort on the individual, like rather than putting the blame on the individual, more work together as a society in order to come to a world where disability is kind of seen as norm. So, and if anyone is interested in learning more about the social model, we're going to cover a little bit more at the end. And we also do this in our training called the Prevention of Violence Against Women with Disabilities training. Thanks, Olivia.
Awesome. So we're now going to have Zoe, who's another wonderful member of our team. She's our Sexual and Reproductive Health Project Officer. And she's going to speak a little bit about one of the ways that we can act against disability stereotypes, and that's through challenging our own internalized ableism. Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks, Olivia and Tess. So I too am one of the people that are privileged to work for women with disabilities, and I don't have a disability. So I wanted to talk a little bit about ableist ideas and stereotypes, this idea of internalized ableism. So as a person without a disability or with a disability, we all grow up in a society that holds ableist ideas, like Tess and Olivia explained. And for us, that often means that we have ideas in our head that might pop up time to time, like some of the examples that Tess gave around, like, oh, I wouldn't date a disabled person or something like that. And even though we know these ideas aren't what we truly think or value, it's important to challenge these ideas with the facts, with what we know, with what we see, and educating ourselves to think about why we're having these ideas, or whether we need to learn more to challenge these ideas. So for me, I think the thing that I've really learned is that even though I will still continue to have these ideas sometimes and they pop up unconsciously, I don't judge these ideas. I just make sure that I'm challenging them, and that I challenge them when they come up in conversation, when people don't realize that they've said something that's ableist, or, you know, or they're communicating, you know, a negative stereotype about people with disability or women with disability. So I want to encourage you all to challenge those thoughts and keep challenging them. And it's a lifelong process. It doesn't mean that you're going to be perfect tomorrow just because you came to our training. So keep on learning.
Thanks, Zoe. I've been delivering this training for 2 years and I'm definitely not perfect. So as an able-bodied person, I would say I've been guilty of some of the things that we've talked about today in my life. And the important thing is not to beat yourself up for that. It's just to keep working and to keep improving ourselves. And as Zoe said, challenging those ideas so that we don't act in a way that reflects them. So thank you, Zoe. And we're going to come on now to our fourth and final driver, which is sexist and ableist peer relations that emphasize aggression and disrespect towards women with disabilities. So sexist peer relations are relationships between men that are characterized by very traditional and often aggressive forms of masculinity. So ideas that reinforce the idea that boys are boys, girls are girls, and that we're inherently different, and therefore clashes between men and women are just the way it's going to be. Examples of this kind of behavior are locker room talk, the bro code, and that kind of boys will be boys attitude that we've all heard many times. These kinds of peer relationships can be really dangerous because they create an environment where people are more likely to excuse men's behavior just on the grounds that they are men, and in some way their behavior is seen as naturally male, maybe the product of their hormones or the way they're raised. And I think it means as well that men are going to be less likely to report violence towards women because they're going to feel like their alliances should be with the other men rather than the women who are experiencing the violence. And another example of this that I use in training is male peer relations, sexist peer relations between fathers and sons. So if you imagine a young boy who maybe gets into a little bit of a fight at school or kinder or something like that, and then another little boy hits him, you might have heard in your life, or you might be able to imagine a dad telling their son that the way that they should handle that is just by hitting them back. And it's pretty easy to see how this young boy might then grow up into a young man who doesn't have any tools in his emotional toolkit to deal with interpersonal conflict other than violence. And he might also not be able to express his emotions in a way that doesn't involve violence. So you can see pretty clearly there how these kinds of sexist peer relations can lead to violence against women more broadly. So we're going to now have another colleague, Carly, our lovely Carly, who's our Experts by Experience and Promotions Coordinator. And she's going to speak a little bit about her own lived experience of this kind of intersection between sexist and ableist peer relations. Thanks, Carly.
Thanks, Olivia. So there are more than 400 types of dwarfism. I have the most common type called achondroplasia. I'm 4 foot and 1 inch tall. Therefore, I am short-statured. Being short in height and female, my difference somewhat gets misconstrued that I seem childlike. Because of this, people like me attract a range of disturbing comments, questions, and behaviours from members of the general public. They can range from being straight out ignorant, where is your community? Are all your family like, you? Can you have a baby? Can you drive a car? Is your house different, like you? Even filming or taking photos of us in public without our permission. Then there is the extreme, which is focused more so on the childlike infantilization of an adult woman who is the size of a child. Behind these comments or questions is something more deviant than just ignorance. There is a violent, threatening undertone. Oh, aren't you cute? Can I take you home? Hey, walking head job. Can I get a freebie? Now that one has been said by both school-aged boys and grown men in public, even shouted from cars driving by as if there is some sort of emergency. Who would have thought? Then there is, I want to take you home and make you my bitch. Can you have sex? Or my favourite, I have always wanted to have sex with a midget. For your information, we do not associate with that word. So how does it make me feel? Not safe. Therefore, I choose to challenge the ongoing infantilization of women with disabilities. We are not here to fulfill your disgusting fantasies.
Thank you, Carly. And I will say on behalf of everyone here, gross. All right, Tess, I'll pass back to you now.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia. And thank you so much, Carly, for that reality check. So in the disability space, ableist peer relations can have a similar kind of effects for people with disabilities, like how Olivia was talking about sexist peer relations. This is ableist peer relations. And ableist peer relations can happen when relationships between able-bodied people are characterised by disrespect towards people with disabilities who are kind of seen as outside the norm. And so this can include disability support workers bonding with other workers or speaking poorly about their clients or choosing to only socialise with one another whilst treating their clients as only work and rather than people. And this is kind of dehumanising for us. And it occurs also when professionals like healthcare workers choose to speak maybe just directly to their family member or carer and ignoring us. I know that's happened a lot for me. And I just butt in and say, hey, like, I'm here, like, you can talk to me, it's okay. But, you know, it's not up to women with disabilities to do that all the time. And so I wanted to give you another example that's not really healthcare based, but it is based in my community, and it is kind of my experience of going to a nightclub where most of my friends back when I used to go nightclubbing when I was younger were able-bodied, and we used to go out, and because people aren't used to seeing people with disabilities in the kind of nightclub scene, other able-bodied people would go up to my friends and say things like, oh, aren't you so great for taking her out? And luckily my friends are like me, they're a bit fiery, they're a bit feisty, and so straight away my friends would respond with, what are you talking about? She's taking me out. She's the life of the party, like without her we wouldn't be here, like, and they'll kind of just go like, oh, like kind of like gobsmacked or like dumbfounded that they've been put back in their place because they've been challenged. And then because I used to go to that particular nightclub all the time, like every weekend, maybe a lot, anyway, just a lot. And I used to go there all the time, and then on a separate week, another person came up to me, an able-bodied person, and said, you know, Tess, within this nightclub, you've normalised disability. And I guess for me, that speaks to the fact that the more and more that women with disabilities are present in spaces that we're not used to being present in, the more we can smash down these ableist attitudes and these negative views and stereotypes that can harm us.
All right, so I think we should come on now. Oh, thanks, Tess. To our fourth essential action, because I am aware that we are running a bit short on time. So we can all take action to disrupt sexist and male peer relations where we see them in our communities. And there's a lot of different ways we can do this. So Tess is going to speak briefly about bystander action, and then I'm going to invite one final colleague to share some lived experience insights on inclusion as well. So over to you, Tess.
So one way we can take action to disrupt sexist and male peer relations when we see them in our communities and social service sector is to do so by being an active bystander. And an active bystander is about challenging the structures that we live in and exist in. So, well, and at the same token, when we see ableist peer relations playing out in a group setting, we should call out this behaviour like my friends did in the nightclub. So we can do this in a number of ways, from casting a disapproving look or by directly challenging the behaviour or reporting it to your organisations, your managers and that kind of thing. So, and we need to assess when being an active bystander, when it is safe to call out this behaviour for both ourselves and the prospective target. And maybe another useful tip or effective tip is to pull the perpetrator aside privately to discuss why this behaviour is inappropriate so that they can be more receptive in that private space. And sometimes offering support to the target by saying that what you've experienced is not acceptable and, you know, offering them support can be a useful strategy as well. So, and it's important to note that although it can be challenging at times, we must all work together to challenge these to challenge ableism and sexism through being an active bystander.
So we're going to come on now to our final essential action, which underpins all of the drivers and all of the actions we've talked about already today, and that is promoting and normalising gender equality and disability equality in public and private life. So I want to, I've gone slightly out of order in the interest of time, but I want to invite our colleague Helen, who is our Health Services Program Manager, to just drop in now and speak a little bit about inclusion and how important inclusion is for women with disabilities and all people with disabilities. Inclusion being, of course, one of the really effective ways we can promote and normalise disability equality. So thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you to everyone for being here and for the opportunity to speak. My name, as Olivia said, is Helen Freris, and I hold the role of Health Services Program Manager at WDV. And like some of my colleagues here too, I have a background in social work, and I'm totally blind, and I have a very strong interest in civic and community issues. So I'd like to share with you an example of what can happen when barriers, structural barriers, have been removed and the equalisation of all people is possible. This is an example, recent example from my own life. So we're going from the nightclub to the elections last year, the voting booth, because the Victorian Electoral Commission has for some time had in place Braille ballot papers for people who use Braille and who find the pencil and paper postal vote type ballot papers a barrier to their participation in elections, in local government elections. So last year, I was able to use that service like many others, and something happened. We know that discrimination, as we've heard from our other speakers, creates an underclass or a separate group of people, a distinction between people with power and agency and people who experience barriers to participating in whatever aspect of life that they choose. And when we know that when barriers to inclusion exist, people are assumed, they're fueled on assumptions, in fact, that people have fewer rights and less capacity and interest in participating in life. So, on the other hand, when barriers are removed, it creates a sense of social cohesion and bonding with other people. So last year, with the Braille papers, I could concentrate specifically on who I was going to vote for, what the issues and policies were, and what was happening in my community. I didn't have to worry about the logistics of how I was going to vote. Contrast this with my first experience of voting for this particular council prior to the ballot paper introduction in Braille, where I was asked by the volunteer electoral official assisting to speak up, love, because he was a bit deaf, and the ballot paper needed to be filled in, and that was the only way. So last year, I noticed that I could participate equally in discussions with people I knew in my area, friends and people I knew, about the candidates, what was happening, what the issues were. And it was assumed, therefore, that I had the interest in participating. But I'd like to think that this had wider implications, not just for me, although that was important, but for society. That when barriers are removed, people are given the opportunity, the right and the privilege to exercise an obligation in Australia, which is to contribute to society through voting as an equal participant to society and to our democracy, alongside everyone else who has that right and privilege. So this is about challenging to change the distinctions that are created among people by barriers and exclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. That's a great way to come into our last action here. And I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to go over this document very quickly. But basically, this final resource is contains 10 different actions that organisations can take. So, of course, promoting and normalising gender and disability equality is not just an organisational responsibility, it's an individual responsibility as well. But in this particular resource, we focused at that organisational level and thinking, of course, about disability and social service organisations. So we've got here 10, I won't say simple actions, because of course these things are never simple, but these are 10 very clear, very tangible actions that you can take as an organisation to contribute to a more gender and disability equitable workplace. So that brings us to the end of Tess and my presentation today, and we've gone way over time, so I'm so sorry about that. We were going to have a short Q&A session, but I'm thinking in the interest of time that we may not be able to do that now. So I'll finish up by just very briefly saying that we mentioned a few times that we do offer workforce development training. That's one of the very key aspects of our gender and disability program. And we offer training to disability and social service workforces in all different formats. Of course, we're doing the online thing. Hopefully someday soon we'll be able to do the in-person thing again as well. And all of our training is tailored to the organisational capacity, to the knowledge and skill level of your cohort. And if that's something you're interested in, we want to encourage everybody to please shoot me an email or give me a ring. My phone number's up there and my email address is up there too. And that will also be sent out to you following this session. So I'm going to hand back now to Bianca. Bianca, I'm thinking we've got no time for questions. What do you reckon?
I'm thinking that we didn't actually get any questions through on the chat. So that is perfectly fine if we skip that out. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to email us. So I think that's the key thing there. We can do that. We will have another event coming up in May-ish that will be to release some more resources that will be looking at some videos from women with disabilities talking about preventing violence against women with disabilities and looking at those drivers and essential actions as well. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much, Tess and Olivia, for taking us through our launch of the resources that we launched today. I hope that everybody finds those resources useful to use within your work. If you do have any questions or you do want to approach us for any training or webinars or anything like that, just let us know. We do it at very, very different lengths, so we can do like an hour and a half or we can do 2 days, whatever works for you. So keep us in mind for that. I'll just run through the thank you in general. If we have posted a link in the chat to a Google form for feedback. We really encourage you to do that. Feedback is a lifeline for us. It's very important for us to be able to get some feedback on our events and see if it has been useful for you. So if you do have a chance, please do that. I'll get Carly to repost that up, which I think she just has in there. So that will be up for you. So I would like to thank I'd like to thank our Auslan interpreters, and I would like to thank our captioner for coming along and making this event accessible for us. I would like to thank Leah for opening the event, and I'd like to thank Our Watch for coming along, Melissa, and for our own Jen, talking to the Our Watch resource, and please keep an eye out for the launch of that resource and the resources associated with that coming up. I'd like to thank Rosie and Kira and Swazik and Carly and Zoe and Helen and of course Olivia and Tess again for sharing parts of their lived experience and their life and for bringing that and making this training real and this launch, making it about women with disabilities and capturing our voices within this space. I think it's really important and definitely best practice. And I'd like to thank Jan Earthstar as well, who developed in collaboration with the rest of WDV and Women with Disabilities in consultation these resources with us. So thank you, everyone. Who else am I thanking? Probably our funders as well, so the Victorian Government. So thank you for continuously funding us and for making events like this possible. Please feel free to give us a call or be in contact with us. And the last and of course not the least person is the CSI team that did our IT for us today. So thank you very much, Lucas Hunter, for making sure that our event ran smoothly. And once again, thanks all to everybody that came along to our International Women's Day event. And hopefully you can think of ways that you can choose to challenge violence against women with disabilities. Thanks.